And I'm like, as I'm bashing Facebook as we go live. Hello, Jerad. Hello, Justin. How are you?
Great. Thanks so much for having us.
Hey, absolutely. Jerad, you're calling in from, where are you calling in from right now?
Brooklyn, New York.
Brooklyn, New York. And Jerad, you are, I think, one of our locals here in San Diego, are you not?
I am. I'm right down the road from you.
Right down the road. Excellent. Well, for those, so we've got the both the coasts covered, and we might get some people tuning in from in between. So I'm gonna give Facebook a minute or two just to let everybody know that we are here and that we are live. So I'm gonna chatter for a little bit just so that we don't miss any of this great conversation that's going to happen. So for those of you that might not be familiar, Warwick's is located, as Justin said, we're in San Diego. We're in La Jolla, which is just a little bit north of San Diego. A little sign there says 1896. We're celebrating our 125th anniversary this year. So we've seen and been through, quite a bit in those 125 years. So we're culminating this weekend with a celebration. So if you're in the San Diego area, we're having an open house on Sunday. So come on by. Got some good little giveaways and maybe some gift cards and fun things going on. So for this evening, Jerad and Justin are going to chat for about 35 minutes. In the comment section, we do record this, so it's going to end up on our YouTube channel, but that's not going to be live. But for Facebook, in the comment section there, if you have any questions or comments for Jerad, questions specifically, go ahead and put those into that comment section, and I'll feed those into Justin, and he'll bring them to Jerad. In that comment section as well is where I will put volunteers. Easy for you to just click on that and order it from Warwick's. If you're in the San Diego area, you can choose to pick it up at the store, or believe it or not, independent bookstores actually do ship books. So you can get your book shipped to you. We'd love you to support Warwick's, but if you have a favorite local bookstore, go ahead and order Jared's book from them as well. I mean, it's, we're a good family of indie bookstores. So with that, I think I've given Facebook enough time to know that we're actually live on their platform. So let me introduce these two wonderful gentlemen and we'll get the show on the road here. Jerad W. Alexander has written for Esquire, Rolling Stone, The Nation, Narrative Lee, and elsewhere. He holds an MFA in literary reportage from the New York University Arthur L. Carter School of Journalism. From 1998 to 2006, he served as a U.S. Marine deploying to the Mediterranean, East Africa, and Iraq. He grew up on military bases from the East Coast of the United States to Japan. He currently, like he said, lives in New York City, but calls Atlanta home. He's here today to talk to us about volunteers growing up in the forever war. Joining him is Justin Hudnall. Justin received his BFA from New York University. Okay, I'm going to mess this up. How do you say, is it Tisch? Yeah, you're on mute, but it's Tisch.
Sorry, yeah, Tisch School of the Arts.
Tisch School of the Arts. I was like, is it Tisch? I was like, oh my goodness, I knew I was going to mess that up. He currently serves as the executive director of So Say We All, a San Diego-based storytelling, arts, and education nonprofit. In a prior career, he served with the United Nations in South Sudan as an emergency response officer. He produces and hosts the public radio series Incoming, showcasing stories from the lives of America's veterans told in their own words, straight from their own mouths. With that, gentlemen, have a wonderful conversation. We'll see you in a little bit.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for that wonderful intro. I think we would like to start our talk off just so that we can contextualize some of the conversation for those who haven't read the book with a reading by Jerad from Volunteers. Jerad, take it away.
Thanks. Yellow ribbons began appearing on cars and tacked to bulletin boards at school. Lee Greenwood's country tune, God Bless the USA, found new life on the radio. We hummed it in the halls like gospel hymn, while our insides rotted from the waiting through Halloween, through Thanksgiving, and into the snowy gray slush of December. I spent my nights at Chris's. His mother took us to see Ghost, and suddenly Unchained Melody portended love and loss in a way that made my guts feel weird. Then Memphis Belle came along, and suddenly I wanted to bomb Nazis to ashes with my B-17 Flying Fortress. But I can't. I'm stuck on this base in the snow and lonely, and my stepdad, my dad, is gone, and there is nothing I can do about it. I'm just a dumb kid. And so on clear nights before my mother comes home, I sit on the snow-covered slope between my house and Chris's and look down at all the blinking Christmas lights and amber street lights. And I wish I was somewhere. I wish I were something else. Maybe a fighter pilot, maybe a starship captain, maybe a submarine commander, maybe married to a beautiful girl, maybe just grown. But I wasn't any of those things. There were so many years left and plenty of maybes, and everything seemed so far away, and there was nothing I could do. Our information was a bad circumspection of room. It was a blend of bad circumspection and rumor, all unfounded and unverifiable. I knew nothing. I had barely heard of Dick Cheney or Hosni Mubarak, Margaret Thatcher or Colin Powell, Tariq Aziz or Yitzhak Shamir. Our military world orbited around H. Norman Schwarzkopf, Stormin' Norman as he was called, and he became the hero king or Grant Pershing Patton reincarnate. He was our general, the Atlas who carried the stone burden of all our hopes. He was the man we hoped would grind his American 11.5-inch regular boot into the back of the Iraqis who had shattered our families. Out of that hope burst a strange hot fuel that pushed me past the flat Christmas morning when we opened presents with perfunctory movements and cheap estimations of childhood glee, and then slid quietly into the new year. The news was alive with one deadline, January 15, 1991, the day established by the United Nations for Iraq to pull its troops out of Kuwait or face military action. What that meant wasn't entirely clear, but a dim realization began to form as I listened to the Fighting Falcons take off from the runway and watched them fly on the nightly news. There would be no escaping it, no turning back. The fear of a wounded national pride far too often trumps the preservation of human lives. The Iraqis were not going to leave Kuwait. Battle was coming. I stopped looking at the curve of the fuselage and the glint of sunlight on the canopy of the new Fighting Falcons that had remained behind. Instead, I flipped through books in the school library that showed the dull green bombs and white missiles that hung from their wings. The Mark 80 series bombs and the GBU laser-guided bombs, the Maverick missiles and the 20-millimeter Vulcan 6-barreled cannon that shoots off 6,000 bullets per minute, each bullet larger than an adult thumb. There was the BLU 109, a long bomb with a 1-inch thick steel casing designed to penetrate bunkers and concrete aircraft revetments and annihilate whatever lived inside. Then there was the AIM-9 Sidewinder, the missile perched on the Falcon's wingtips and used to shoot enemy planes from the sky. The Mark 82 Rockeye 2 bomb was my favorite. When a Fighting Falcon cut went loose, it dropped to a certain height and opened like a clamshell, releasing 24 bomblets the size of McDonald's Big Macs that crackled directly above the ground and spread shrapnel into vehicles and people. Even the name sounded cool, Rockeye 2, like the sequel to an action movie I had yet to see but wanted to. These were the weapons I knew would be tossed at the Iraqi army in the desert. I knew they would hit hard. I knew they would aim for the eyes. I knew they would go for the nuts. Inside me, I knew I wanted them to.
That's beautiful, Jerad. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
One of my first questions that I think is appropriate, since we are hosted today by San Diego's oldest bookstore, is that among many things, Volunteers is about the cultures that help shape your decision to enlist in the armed forces. And so much of it is a love letter to all of the Vietnam era war literature you grew up on and cut your teeth, and war literature in general that you read that kind of was your formative experience pre your enlistment. One of the questions that was in my mind as I was reading your book is, when did you make the decision to write about your own war, and having that wealth of literature behind you, what did you know you wanted to do differently than all those other authors?
Well, I started out really just wanting to write a very typical war memoir. I left the military in 2006, and around 2007 into 2008, I started just writing, remembrances of the war itself, my time in Iraq. I had perhaps delusions of writing something like If I Die in a Combat Zone by Tim O'Brien, or A Helmet for My Pillow by Robert Leckie. That was kind of what I was thinking of, something very just, here's what my time in the war was like. It's a very rote memoir at this point. But I was fascinated by that, and I thought that would be an interesting idea. And I did. I wrote, a 45,000 word manuscript that was absolutely terrible, and I tried to sell it and didn't. And I'm very grateful for that, to be honest. But so I put it away after that failure, and I started going to school, and I just kind of went on to write other things and kind of learn more about the job. And I brought it back out in 15, thinking I was going to write about the Marine Corps again, but maybe with a little bit more of a more of a high octane voice to it, something very Gustav Hasford like. And in the process of that, though, I began to write a lot about childhood, sort of the formations of those things, how I became fascinated with the culture in general terms. And as the project grew, those stories grew, and those stories began to overshadow the war, quite frankly. And I began to realize that what I had there was something that, one, which I hoped unique, and that we were looking at the growth of that, the sort of how all these wars sort of perpetuated my involvement in the next one. And that was something that I thought was a really interesting idea. And, I was lucky that other folks found it interesting as well. And I just decided to kind of grow it from that point. But I still wanted Iraq in there. That is the culmination of an idea that I had as a kid. And so even if it's a toxic one, and so it needed to be there. So I finding a way to try to, balance between my childhood and then my experiences in the war, try to find some kind of synergy and between those two things was really the hardest part about it. But I knew I needed both of those in at the same time.
That was definitely a choice that I picked up on and appreciated, because I find that there is a lot of pressure in veteran literature to write about combat. And frankly, I find combat to often be some of the least interesting parts of a war memoir, because it gets boiled down to, as you mentioned, like the military pushes sports metaphors now into its business. And it is hard to derive meaning from those moments of action other than who went where and did what, because as the narrator who lived it, your brain does shut off, right? And it's not really thinking on a higher level other than survival and what needs to immediately be done. So that choice to kind of bring in your childhood reminded me of this quote that and there's so many wonderful references to other veteran writers in your book, and one that stuck to me was Tony Swafford in Jarhead writes about how he kind of feels bad for all these filmmakers who tried to make anti-war movies, because it's impossible, because Full Metal Jacket and all of those Vietnam era war movies that were supposedly anti-war or intentionally anti-war, the poor filmmakers had little known idea that a bunch of jarheads in boot camp would be racking magazines to their helmet, getting motivated by those movies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I found that your choice to focus so much on what came before and after your service to kind of be an answer to that. And I wanted to ask you if that was intentional.
It was in a large degree. Part of my learning process was I struggled with the war is boring sort of, the axiom or the phrase that we use, and part that because I found combat, there was a lot of little things in combat I think that I wanted to grab onto, like little details, like mainly about the attitudes of people who were under fire. There was a very much obviously it was dependent upon its intensity, but generally I found a lot of folks to try to engage with humor, and obviously that's a defense mechanism to a certain degree, but there's a lot of bravado in that. And there was also this desire to capture it in the moment, either through taking photographs with a little pocket camera or a video camera. I saw infantrymen doing this nonstop. They would, every time a bomb would land, they would take a picture of it. And that was something that I thought was fascinating. Why would you want to record that? But they did it prolifically. It was my job too, as a correspondent. But I wanted to try to examine, a little, you were right about the films. I mean, and so was Tony. I was raised on Platoon practically. And my friends who were veterans, who were combat veterans, we reference that film even now. It's still very much we recognize ourselves in it to a certain degree. I went into the Marine Corps with the idea of being Chris Taylor.
Right.
That was the archetype that I wanted to follow. And I think to a certain degree I kind of did. I think I was sort of a mixture of that and Joker maybe, but for better or worse. But I also think that it was important to sort of look at, like, those archetypes are not the best models either. I mean, they're very limiting, and they're very they create expectations that aren't realistic. And while those filmmakers and those novelists certainly tried to do something, noble with their efforts, it's still a distillation of the experience, and you'll lose a lot in that. And I wanted to try to grab that and showcase that in some way.
You bring up a really interesting point when you're talking about how during conflict, service members were so involved in the capturing and the reporting, whether, and there's obviously the time-honored tradition of the letter back home, but our generation of veterans is really unique because the speed with which they wrote about their conflict compared to previous wars was often, in some cases, real time. I mean, some dudes got busted down for having blogs while leading infantry and mechanized platoons, infamously. I was wondering what you ascribe to that, what made that so different for our era in terms of this almost compulsion to put it out there. Was it the technology, or was there something in the air, or was it a combination of growing up on this bevy of war literature and media that you referenced that made it kind of almost a third eye on you as you're serving, right? That if there's not a camera on me, there's a camera in my pocket, and I need to do something with this. Did you feel that pressure while you were downrange, being so self-aware of how war is portrayed?
Absolutely. I mean, I could feel those archetypes coming through me in the moment. And you're right. I think, well, to start off with, I think that you have a combination of things. One, the technology makes it really easy. Even then, I was there in 05, 06, the smartphone didn't exist yet, but it was very easy to capture images. I mean, it was, a rifleman could go down to the PX and spend $150 on a little digital camera, and you could take pictures of his war. But I think that, and the reason, but as far as motivations for that, I think that the stories we've told about war over the past, say, 50 to 75 years has lended itself to want to grab onto a piece of it for themselves. There's a sense of tourism to it. At one point I had a line in the book that said, look, college kids go to Europe, Marines go to war. I mean, that's like we enlist for that as our sort of outlet, post high school outlet to a certain degree. And I don't mean for that to sound trite, but it is very much, I think, very similar to that. I think there's a kind of escapism in the military. But I also know that a lot of Marines, I think, or at least in my content, or my experience, they recognized they were on the edge of something really unusual for their lives. And, and I think that they kind of wanted to bottle it a little bit. The lore of the Marine Corps was they've been sort of imbued with that, like those constant narratives of heroes on battlefields. It's as old as the hills, and now they were in a place where those things might occur, and the likelihood of them happening were slim, but they were in the space for that. And I think that they really wanted to capture that. And I know that I did too. Like, I wanted to sort of look at that and grab onto it, hold it, put it in my pocket to examine later. I had a friend of mine who recorded firefights with a digital recorder. And when he got back to the States, he would play them for people, and not to show them, not in some sort of ghoulish way, but just like, this is what this sounds like. Here are the sounds of this. This is what you hear when you're in that environment. And he wasn't engaging in himself with enemy fire. He would just happen to be in a place that was, beneath an exchange of fire, and all the snaps and the whizzes and the bangs. It was really like he was sort of reveling in the surrealness of it all. And I think that's a big, that was one example I saw of that, of people trying to just grab a little piece of that dirt, put it in their pocket, and bring home with them.
Yeah, almost. You beautifully talk in the book about how, politics aside of the war, that it's really not as much about the motivation to go to war, the righteousness of it that you felt at the time, even at the age of, early to mid 20s, as much as that fear of missing out on your chance to be a part of that history. Right. And I feel like I feel like that kind of boils down to that hero's journey, right? Where it kind of trumps all politics, all war, is that young men need to do something to feel like their lives matter. And your decision to kind of reroute your military career fairly close to the end of it to ensure that you got to deploy and didn't miss out and didn't go through the Marines, not even on a FOB, but just stateside, was so heavy on your head. And the personal sacrifices you made to your personal life at that time, the people you were seeing, the relationships you were forming. Can you talk about that decision to find a way to get on the plane?
That was the most maddening aspect, I think, of my last, because I did 8 years, and that was the most maddening aspect. I mean, it was a single driving, motivation for basically everything I did and didn't do. And there's a lot of things that I wasn't the best Marine in the world. There was I had a lot of opinions about the way some things were being done, and that was probably to my detriment. I was very much a rebellious, mouthy sergeant. But all of that was in service to wanting to go overseas. I had no patience for people who didn't. I thought that I had very little. It was bizarre to me when people would say if I miss it, I'm fine. I had no language I had no way of understanding that. No, like, you should just leave the military, and there's no shame in that. Like, if you want to go do something else in your life, that's completely acceptable. But yeah, but it was also toxic. It's also, it was very much I was sort of, chasing a rabbit in a way. And, I was trying to find a loophole of some kind to find myself on a plane overseas. I think of some of the actions I took right there, just to get into Iraq. I mean, it was, so the details of it, the minutia of it is basically like, I had a friend of mine who was basically in charge of the 2nd Marine Division's assignments for public affairs going overseas in the second rotation of their year-long, operations over there. And he called me up and said, listen, I had called him and asked him to go to an exercise, and he called me back and said, how about exercise and the whole thing? But even then, we had to hide it from people. There were certain people that were transitioning out of that unit that we needed to kind of keep it quiet, and then we had to kind of play this weird game of this little shell game just to put myself in that position. It was a little maddening. It was maddening because it was, like, how I'm asking to go do the thing, and I'm having to go through these sort of bureaucratic hurdles to do the thing that we're literally enlisting in the military to do. And I thought that was really strange. And that to me is just a testament of just bad leadership and some bureaucratic issues. But it was very much it was a toxic hunt for that experience. I felt like if I got out, there would have been a big hole, big cavity right in the center of my experiences in the military. To do all that work, to get that close, but not actually, experience that, the last 1,000 yards of American foreign policy,
right?
Which is kind of how we refer to it in some contexts. And it would have been really, like, I don't know that I would have been very proud of myself as a Marine if I hadn't done that. That was my mentality at the time. I think it's probably had changed somewhat, but even at that time, I was having conversations like, I'm going to get out and I'm going to wonder what this experience was supposed to be, and I heard similar things from other Marines who were being either forced out for medical reasons or just couldn't run the eye of the needle into the combat zone. That was something that was very present in my experience.
Right. I mean, it does feel impossible to avoid the sports metaphors, but to go through all that and then to end as kind of combat backbencher, and you write about the covetedness of the combat action badge, right?
Yeah.
And we have a comment in chat from our friend Brent Hannafy. Hey, Brent, thanks for watching. He writes that he was always fascinated by the decision to use GoPro cameras to record gunfights, which kind of goes to what you were saying about that need to preserve your role in history, and that I was here, and that, whatever else happens in my life. And something that you touch on that I think is just profoundly self-aware, and also kind of speaks to the dichotomy of the modern service member of, like, because you had read all this and just absorbed the culture that you grew up in, fully aware that combat can also, I caught myself before I cussed on camera, but mess you up profoundly, have profound emotional impacts for the rest of your life, right?
Mhm.
And also feel this weight that, to not be exposed to that and to see how you come out the other side would be devastating.
Right. Yeah. It was very much, you were willing to risk the dice roll, and, I remember, and I talk about this at one point in the book, of sort of running the loose odds of being wounded, my friend and I, her and I sat down and we just kind of did the math, like, okay, there's X number of Marines overseas. This is the number of wounded we've seen so far. Let's just do the ratio, and these are conversations that we had, and she had wanted to experience the war herself, and eventually did, and thankfully she came home fine. But these were conversations that were taking place. We were looking at this, going, okay, I can get this experience, and what is it going to potentially cost me?
Right.
And it's kind of mad. It is. I mean, I've been using the word madness a lot tonight, but it's kind of a nutty thing to say, right? Like, I could go to war and I can experience this. No, the downside is I could lose a limb of my life.
Right.
I'll roll the dice on that. And I think back, it's funny because I think a lot about, like, I am incredibly, almost tears in my eyes, grateful I didn't get wounded over there. Just like, it's
it spared you a lot of bad times at the VA, at least, right?
At a minimum, but I think, and I had my close
bureaucracies.
Sure, yeah, and I had my close calls with ordnance, and all those little bits of metal flying through the air, and I sometimes I'm amazed that it's like I almost feel like sometimes I should have been rewarded by getting wounded, like for my kind of myopic attitudes toward it, and my sort of dogged hunt for that experience. In fact, I remember thinking that at the time. I was like, this is the last thing I'm going to do in my 8 years in the Marine Corps. I was getting out. I was done with the day-to-day of it, and I was like, if I got killed over there, it would make complete karmic sense for me. Like, I would have to just kind of rationalize and accept that. Yeah. But it's bananas to even beginning to have those thoughts.
Sure. And we'll unpack all that, and that's connected to the brotherhood that is indoctrinated in the service, right? Where it's like you didn't deserve to not get wounded because others did, right? So why am I special? Why am I exceptional? And so all of that pressure to go to the combat zone where you might get wounded, and then all of the pressure that you were one of the lucky ones going out. So it's really hard to come out a winner, is one of the takeaways. That your story is not unique in that sense too, right?
No, it is, war is inherently deleterious. I mean, there are net positive wars. I mean, we could probably rattle off one or two in our history that have produced net positives for a group of people or a society or a set of values. World War II being a great example of that, to a point. But those are obviously reactionary wars to an ugly state of affairs. So it's better to just not have that at all. But for the individual, it's a net negative. There's very little that comes out of war that's positive. It depends on, and obviously depends on how violent your experience was, but you come out with moral injury, you come out with psychic damage, and these are things that are very, very subtle. They sometimes they're hidden for a long time, and you might find yourself fine, and then 3-4 years later find yourself snapping at a car backfiring, or the usual. You could pick anything from the catalog of trauma, anything, the catalog of symptoms of trauma, and as an example of that. But I think that it's something of it is a deleterious aspect of humanity, but it is one that we do to ourselves. It's not a pathogen that infects us and then we go off and kill ourselves. It's something we do. We elect to do this, and that's something that has to be addressed, I think.
All right, which speaks to the title of your book. If you could elaborate on the choice of that, Volunteers.
Well, I had two ideas there, and the team that forms around a book had a hand in molding that. But one of the early titles I had was "For All It's Worth," which is a reference to the similar, kind of a close reference to the song "For What It's Worth" by Buffalo Springfield, which is I had as in the book. But I was also looking at the Volunteers of America, and then it got truncated to Volunteers. but I wanted to well, I will tell you, one of my fears with the title was that it was going to dissuade a reader who maybe is trying to avoid stories of patriotism and conflict, because I was a little bit concerned about that. I wasn't interested in writing a pro-war screed, or I didn't want to be projected as that, and so that was
we
a
have
little
enough
bit of
Navy
concern.
SEALs. I feel like you can't. It's like the joke: you can't be a Navy SEAL without getting a Disney Plus deal to write.
Right? Yeah, and I
about it.
do not want to be categorized in those ranks. I think that a lot of that stuff is not the greatest, and it's a lot of it's
certainly
dishonest.
not worthy of a Warwick's one-on-one interview on Facebook Live.
But nevertheless, but I like the idea of volunteers, because we all do this. We volunteer. There's an 100% volunteer military. 100. Every one of us who ever put on that uniform did so electively. We chose that over something else, and even a percentage of that chose to go into combat arms. When they may very well have done something else. I was one of those people, and so I think that's sort of what I wanted to sort of poke at the title.
One of the there's a quote towards the end of your book by Karl Marlantes, and I'm going to paraphrase it here and get it wrong, so just to put that out there to cover myself. But the quote you referenced, paraphrase, is that the military is not responsible for brainwashing Americans into becoming killers. It's just the finishing school for a culture that does that at birth for a lot of us, right? War is adorned in the trappings that we experience since childhood, and your book's kind of a proof of that statement by showing us your entire childhood and how it was just so laden, growing up on an air base, yes, but also how the media you consumed and the culture you were part of, and one of the ways you put it is that it was a path that was decided. It was inevitable, this weight of inevitability that you would join the armed forces. At that time, you hadn't selected the Marine Corps necessarily, but you knew that was where your terminus would lead in adolescence. What were the factors that you feel most strongly anchored you to that kind of preordained fate in a way, whereas others you grew up with went in other directions, and kind of baffled a lot of the annoying preconceptions I feel people have about why people join, that it's that you one of the lines I love the most is that people don't die for money. Poverty is not on its own enough of a motivation, but pride will get you killed. Pride will make you willing to kill and die.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
What were those things for you that you felt were, like, looking back, the inevitable factors?
There was nothing else in our world that I could see that was going to offer me an immediate sense of adventure and gratification through it. There was nothing about our day-to-day lives. Like my last 2 years of high school, I was friends with folks who were largely civilian. They didn't have a real deep connection to the military at all. And every one of them went off to college, and they had a great experience, and to a certain degree I envy them. But at the time, the idea of just going back into school just seemed, even with the freedoms that college tends to offer, it was like wet toast. It was just, there was no animus to it. There was no sense of the unknown in a large way. And while I understood a lot about the military prior to enlisting, I knew that the experience was going to offer me a sense of, oddly enough, an individuality. I was going to be given my own sense of self through that lens, which is a little bit fraught with some, a little bit of hypocrisy, in a sense. Like, you shouldn't have to have somebody endow you with an identity. You kind of grow that on your own terms. But at 18, I was looking for that. I found that particular identity just enthralling, just absolutely fascinating. The average GI carrying a rifle, across France or Vietnam or Korea, there was no greater image that I wanted to aspire to than that one. And anything else didn't even come close in terms of its attractiveness.
That's really interesting, because the word that pops into my head is identity, right? And there is this idea that, in the military that you are, my buddy Brian Simpson has this great line in one of his stories about how, you could be anybody in the military. It'll make you somebody, but it'll make you anybody, right? One of the things that you talk about in your childhood growing up and being in kind of I originally in a military based culture around other military kids, and then in LA around civilians, and never really feeling like you belonged anywhere. But also it occurred to me that having all of this critical thought and self-awareness of military culture going into the military, that it might not have felt like you belonged while you were in the Marine Corps either, and downrange, because there's no monolithic veteran, there's no monolithic Marine. Did you feel a sense of outsiderness even during your service and deployment?
Oh, absolutely, I did. And there were places in my experience where it was really pointed. My first 18 months after the infantry school, I was in a rifle company with the 6th Marine Regiment, and I felt a considerable sense of outsider, like just being an outsider and observer. I think it's partly because I was I was sort of overwhelmed by some of the social aspects of it, but also I was doing the thing that I wanted to do, but I was finding it to be I was a little bit stunned by it in a large way, and I was a little bit emotionally, not quite emotionally mature enough to sort of navigate it. But even then, even as I went on to I became a better Marine, and I became more, part of the unit better, and I sort of, fit in better. I really did still have that sort of observational attitude I had about it, maintained. I was very much just sort of a step or two back or to the side, just kind of looking at it, obliquely, or taking it in as it's happening while also participating in it. One of the early ideas I had about when I went to rewrite this book, or begin to write it off the earlier stuff that I'd written after I got out, was I kind of wanted to do a very Hell's Angels-ish sort of, piece of ethnography about the Marine Corps, something that was very, very journalistic, something that sort of dissected its culture by virtue of how I experienced it. And that was because I was so separated from it, even then, that I was able to sort of take a couple of steps back and look at it with a kind of a sense of a biopsy, So yeah, most of my time in the military, I felt very just kind of removed and stepped away, from the experience in a large way, while at the same time still being readily able to participate.
Just not being able to stifle the eye roll when when the Moto songs came on.
Oh Lord, oh those eye rolls. That strained my eyes so much. Yeah.
We had a couple good questions from chat. From our lovely Amanda Kassar asks, did you get any backlash from friends, family, or colleagues for speaking or thinking critically about the moral injury you talk about?
I haven't. I everybody I've talked to who's read this, and anybody who's ever reached out to me about it, and it's still relatively early in this process, so those things might be coming, but everybody has been very, very positive. And I've had folks who were in the book that I haven't talked to in quite some time reach out, and one person in particular wrote a very, very long and heartfelt email about how much this person felt sort of seen by it, and just sort of, I don't want to pat myself too much in the back, but she was effectively like, you said a lot of things here that I couldn't articulate even then, and sometimes it was hard to do even now. So I was very, very grateful. I've been really blessed by the fact that I've had people who have read it and have been really just kind of happy with the work. I hope that stays true. I hope that, but at the same time, if somebody does have a position on it that's maybe different from mine, I would love to know it.
Maybe just don't read the comments on military.com. or do. It's its own kind of entertainment. But let me just say that they are always thoughtful and very well meditated upon before they hit the enter key over there.
Yes, they are.
Another question from Brent Hannafy on the subject of being wounded. What do you think of the guilt that some people feel who made it through the war unscathed while others didn't?
Well, I think it's a very real thing. It's probably one of the most defining aspects of PTSD, at least as far as military or infantry combat goes, or war it goes in general terms. I have friends who have expressed to me deep guilt over, fellow soldiers who were killed, even away from them, where they had no agency to change what occurred. They would lose a friend in combat someplace that they were nowhere near, and would carry around a remarkable sense of guilt and sort of a burden for that. And I'm leery of defining the origins of that. Excuse me. It's a racetrack outside my house. But I don't know. I kind of wonder. I think that's something that's worthy of exploring more. I wish I had a better answer for you. I think that I definitely think it's a key component to post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right. Absolutely. If I can find my own notes here. And by the way, chat, please do feel free to jump in here. We love to have a conversation where possible. Towards the end of the book, you talk about the inevitability of becoming a veteran, about how, and you say something that I really, that really struck me, about how there's just too much of your life, the vast majority of it, compared to those first few minutes when you process out that you don't know anything else. How could you do anything else but become part of veteran culture and that veteran narrative, and therefore fall into some of those veteran stereotypes? What for you was your process in forming an identity post-military?
It was a slow one, but one of the things that I try to recommend other veterans is find something that's exactly the opposite of what you, within reason, find something that's opposite to what you did. So if you were an infantryman, for the sake of argument, what I did is I went and found a theater company, and a little community theater company, and I started working for them. I had an interest in the art, but find something that's just puts you in a very, very different place, emotion, and just with people that you just would not interact with if you kind of remain in that very, very narrow, that very close circle. The veteran community is fantastic, and it will always be there, I think, for a lot of folks. That should give them a really good foundation to branch into other things and to try other things. Obviously, we all got to pay the rent, so it can get a little bit dicey on that front. But and then if you're coming out of the military with some significant combat trauma, that can add to that. It can bring a dimension that makes it even more difficult. But really lean into finding something that's not the military and try it out. That's not to say that the military is wrong or bad, or your experiences are not deserving of exploration or remembrance or honor, but it's a big world, and finding something that's not that is really important. It was something that helped me out a lot, was just getting plugged into different communities and just sort of being around folks who had no idea what that world was. That was a huge help for me.
Another question from our friend Amanda. Do you think that everyone who has seen combat has PTSD? And if they don't, are those people equipped neurologically, psychologically, in some way that neurotypical people aren't?
That's a big question. That's a little bit out of my pay grade. I would say that there's probably it's too big of a subject to suggest that it's a binary. I don't think that everyone who sees combat is coming home with trauma. I think that there's a likelihood, there's probably a good odds that there are folks who do come back without a considerable amount of it, or at least, but also we're trying to prove a negative there to a certain degree. So if we're, how do you display an absence in that way? Especially if the folks are just simply, if those individuals are just simply not reporting issues. So I don't know. I don't really have a good answer for the question, other than to say that it's a possibility that could be true.
You talk about, if anybody else has any more questions, go ahead and toss them out here real quick. I'll just throw one more out. So you talk about not wanting to write that kind of stereotypical pro-war novel that I think we're all very grateful you did not and achieve that goal. But in today's world, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to escape politicization as a veteran. And there's this new term that I was, introduced to just recently by some veterans called detrooping, where, it's the phenomenon where, if you are the kind of veteran that the person agrees with, then it is thank you for your service and, the 9 yards of patriotism. But when you step out of line with my political beliefs, then it disappears almost. It's erased in relevance. All that honor goes out the window because you're not the kind of veteran I signed up to support, right?
Wow.
How do you feel? How have you been navigating the kind of political landscape? Because I imagine your opinion carries a little more weight as somebody who has participated in America's foreign policy.
Well, one of the things it's funny you say that, because one of the things I try to tell folks is that I kind of, my mentality about veterans in general terms is that as it relates to politics is, look, we have a tendency to assume that the military, not veterans, I think veterans understand this, but I think that Americans at large have a tendency to assume that people who enlist in the military are some kind of special breed outside of the average American. And it's not. Like everybody started out as a civilian. We just kind of went in that direction instead of another. But we're not superhuman. And while we might have some values that the military sort of amplifies in some way, at the end of the day, we have some of the same characteristics and attitudes. And so I always warn civilians of being to be a little wary of assuming that a veteran has the right idea about politics or policy. That what they say is more important than the platform from which they say it, and to be very discerning in that way. Like I'm not a believer in the notion that a general would make a good politician just by virtue of the fact that they work in two very different organizations, and they have very different rules and requirements. And I also think that a general might be a little myopic in terms of foreign policy, just as much as somebody who isn't involved with it at all. So but that said, I try to take my politics very, I try to take it, I tend to lean left a little bit, more so than I think many veterans do, or rather, the more than the stereotype is presented. I think that there's a lot of left-leaning veterans out there, quite frankly, and I'm pleased to know quite a few. And so with that means that I tend not to use my status as a veteran as a hammer from which I beat on a political point. You tend to see that from your Alan West, your those kinds of folks, your Dan Crenshaw's. My veteran status is an indicator of acumen. It's patently not. It is not at all. Not what. Yeah, I thought that was nuts when Dan Crenshaw came out with that video of him doing his halo jump and doing a bunch of CIA missions, as if somehow his ability to do those things are going to get votes in Congress. I failed to understand the connection between those two. I still am trying to find it. But there are plenty of folks in that part of the world who think that equals some sort of extra ability to navigate the halls of politics, right, which I think is sort of insane.
We have one more question. And what's a great memory from your service that you like to think of and feel like sharing? And is it reminiscent and reminding yourself something that helps with PTS potentially, or other negative feelings about service?
I think I was thinking of something this morning, and it reminded me of the film Three Kings. If some of our viewers have seen that film,
one of the greatest movies in which a helicopter is shot down by a football.
So in Iraq, I get really motion sick, and I was riding in the back of this Iraqi, they called it an APC, but really it was just a big Land Rover with this sort of armor bed on it, fully enclosed with a little turret in the top. And I was riding in it with a pair of canine dogs and these two Marine handlers. And I was going on a small sweep with the Iraqi army. I got really ill in the back of that thing because there's no ventilation and it was, very warm in there. So we do the sweep, we finished it up to, at the end of the day, and we're getting ready to make the trek back to our camp, and I'm not getting back in this APC. This is just not going to happen. So I happen to look around and I see this brilliant Nissan SUV parked in the convoy. And, the Iraqi army was kind of a, hodgepodge of vehicles. They had just your typical Hiluxes and your SUVs, and they had their big trucks that they hauled their troops in. And I just happened to see this Nissan SUV, and there was only one person in it, and it was this Iraqi soldier behind the wheel. I just walked up to it and I opened the door and got in. And I said, listen, I'm getting a ride with you, because my job was very autonomous as a correspondent. I could kind of navigate my way along the line as I needed to a large degree. So, and I was an NCO. And so that gave me a little bit of, cachet in that respect. And so I just got into this thing. And now, to understand the context of this, it wasn't armored at all. If it caught an IED or a landmine, it would have blown the thing to a billion pieces. Like, it would have just disintegrated us. Knowing that, I just kind of threw caution to the wind. I just kind of opened my flak jacket. I turned the stereo on, the AC on full blast, and we rode back to the camp. He ended up being like a captain, I think, and he was just befuddled. He was sitting there just when he took off down the road, and I was like, well, this is my life right now. And I took my helmet off, and I just cruised back to this, the 20 miles back to this camp, in this just beautiful, blissful state, riding passenger in this nice little car. And but it reminds me of that film, because they do that. They commandeer all these Lexus and all that, and they go on some mission in them. And I was like, I wish I had Chicago, like a little CD of, if you leave me now, I'd have played it just for the just for the reference. I don't think he would have got it. In fact, I think he would have thought I was nuts, but more than he already did.
That's a beautiful scene. And there are a few greater moments than knowing in the moment that you're a character in the novel of your life, right?
Right. Yeah.
Well, I'm so happy to have gotten to talk with you this hour, Jerad, and I heartily and earnestly recommend everybody go out and buy your book. I really enjoyed the hell out of reading it.
Thank you so much, Justin. I appreciate that.
And we're a wrap, right? That was a great conversation.
Thanks.
Thank you both very much. I know that the book just released, but it's one of the questions that we always seem to ask. What are you working on next, Jerad?
I've got a couple of things. I'm trying to get back to this novel I'm almost done with. I'm really close. And I'm going to, once this sort of calms down and I can get back to normal on that, I'm going to rep that up. And then I have ideas for another novel and 2 nonfiction works. So
wow,
I've got a dance card that's a bit full.
Good. You got some ideas coming. So that's awesome. Yeah. So novels, that's interesting. Did you always wanted to get into?
Yeah, I kind of want to be I want to do both, creative nonfiction and fiction. Yeah.
Fantastic. Mm-hmm. Justin, tell us about something that's So Say We All, anything you want to tell us to people to come and tune into or anything?
Yeah, for those of you in the San Diego area, we are back doing live storytelling shows on the last and first Thursday of every month. You can learn more at our website, sosaywellonline.com. And the newest season of our incoming radio show will be back on the podcasts here very shortly in the next couple of weeks, which Jerad will be a guest. And we have other podcasts, including literary horror fiction, Listen with the Lights Off, and other things to tantalize your eardrums with. So if you like the experience of somebody speaking very intentionally and soothingly in your ears at an intimate level, then I would love it if you would join us. That's at sosaywellonline.com to learn all about that. And if you have a story to tell, get involved. That's where you can do that too.
Fantastic. Jerad, do you have a website or anything you can send people to, or are you on any social media that you want to share?
Yeah, sure. I have a website. It's jaradalexander.com. And then I'm on Twitter at Jerad_Alexander.
Excellent. All right, you two, thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation. Best of luck with the book. It's fantastic. And Justin, thank you for your time as well.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Have a
good
good
night,
night.
everybody.